art papers and surfaces. So what I kind of did to start is I wanted to talk about what is kind of the most important component of paper, or one of the most important components of paper, because there are several things, but paper tooth is one of them. And what that refers to is just kind of how smooth to how rough the paper is. So this is specifically looking at drawing paper specifically. And then we'll kind of talk about painting too, because painting, you could really work on any type of surface so long as the paper can withstand wet media. It could be smooth to rough. But when you're looking at drawing in particular, you want to think about the smoothness of the paper. And I'll break down like marker paper and talk about why that's important, that that's smooth versus like a pastel charcoal paper, that being super rough, why that's important. So we'll just kind of talk about some of those things, but this is like a nice little chart looking from kind of smooth to rough, and kind of, you can look right in the middle. If you look at kind of like a cold, that would be like a cold press paper, would be like your typical graphite pencils, colored pencils, but then it's like graphite pencils can work really on any of these. It's just kind of what it's most suitable for. So looking at smooth paper, so smooth paper, there's very little texture. I mean, if you look very closely at really high quality smooth drawing paper, you can see little bits of still what that tooth in the paper, but it's going to be really smooth. Now you can get like marker paper, which I'll talk about in a minute, which it's like completely smooth and you can't see like any texture at all. But smooth paper is great for drawing detail. You can get very, very detailed because you're not seeing all those little bumps and valleys of the paper. However, your one drawback is you're not able to add as many layers of color because there's not as much surface there for you to build up your color. So that's kind of the one drawback of smooth paper. Medium paper, so you're starting to see like hills and valleys of medium paper. They're not as obvious, but they're still there. If you're bringing in like a wet medium, you can see like glazes of color will hit the peaks. There's variations, which I'll show you an image of this too in just a minute so you can see what I'm talking about there. Medium tooth paper, it's not going to take as many layers as rough paper, but of course it's going to take more than that smooth paper. So that's just how much that paper can handle before you've smashed down all the fibers of the paper and it just can't take any more color or tone, graphite, whatever you're working with. And you can usually tell when that happens because your last application is almost a little shiny. And you can see that happening with graphite, you can see that happening with colored pencil, and you can even try just doing like a little light layer on the paper and then kind of a medium pressure to heavy pressure, and then you can see that happening to the fibers of the paper. And then rough paper, of course, hills and valleys of rough paper are quite obvious. Light glazes of color kind of hit the peaks, leave the valleys open, untouched. So that means you have to go back, you have to add heavy pressure, you have to add more layers to fill that paper in, or perhaps you want bits of the paper to show through. And sometimes that's kind of the quality of rough paper. So like in watercolor terms, usually watercolor terms is the hot press, cold press, rough, but this could apply to any type of paper. It's simply how the paper is made. So with a press, imagine like big rollers. So when you have hot press paper, those rollers are really close together. So that paper is going through, it's a lot tighter, thus pressing it down more and making it really, really smooth. Okay, so cold press, again, it's going to take on color really smoothly, but the tooth allows for slight irregularities and graining in washes. Okay, or sorry, that was hot press. And then so that's extremely smooth surface is really good for like India ink. It is good for watercolor techniques. You could do some gold leaf with it, really, really smooth. And then that cold press paper, those the press is just slightly looser, allowing that paper just to have a little bit more breathe room as it's going through the press, thus leaving some more texture there. And then of course the rough is even less pressure, which of course this allows for maximum graining of washes, accidental highlights, texture. Some of those natural, like beautiful things that happen with watercolor happen more so on rough paper than they do on like a hot press paper. And so you can, this is a little teensy tiny blurry, but you can at least get this idea with the hot press that it's really, really smooth, and that rough, you can see all the different kind of textures and buildup of the paint, versus that hot press you can't. So it's just a different effect. So, you know, you can even sometimes get little sample packs of all these papers. I remember when I was in college, I did that, and I tried all of them. And I got to see firsthand in front of me, like how the paper takes the water and absorbs it, or what the paint looks like when it's dry on hot press versus what it looks like rough. And I think when you play around with different little bits of paper like that, when you're doing a final painting, you can decide, oh, I want rough paper because I want the paint to have this quality, or I want hot press because I want it to have this quality. So it's you know, one is not better than the other. It's just like knowing them so you can make the choice for what you want your art to look like. And then we have weight. Weight is another important component of paper. Now this is watercolor paper. I'll show you a chart on the next slide that will show some sketch paper and drawing paper too. But weight is something, one, I think when you start to get a little bit more familiar with papers, you can tell weight or roughly which one is at least heavier by looking at it. And really when you pick it up, you will feel the weight. A 300-pound paper is a lot heavier than a 90-pound paper. And so sometimes I'll choose lower weight papers because they're cheaper for testing, for sketches, for things like that. And I'll choose a higher weight paper for something more polished or finished that I know, you know, I'm spending time on. So this little chart just kind of shows you, and really here we focus on the weight in pounds is what's most important, but kind of some basic paper. So if you look at like sketch paper, that's only 60 pounds compared to watercolor, which could be, I mean, watercolor does vary, but a standard watercolor or an average watercolor might be like 140 pounds. So you can see like a higher weight typically is going to translate that you could use wet media on it, whereas a lower weight is typically going to be dry media only. So drawing and sketch papers, because there are differences between the two. Like if you look at sketchbooks like this, sometimes they'll say sketch, sometimes they'll say drawing. The biggest difference between these two styles is simply the weight. Just the weight of it. Like a sketch paper might be like 60 pounds, where a drawing paper might be like 80. So sketch paper is going to be thinner. You can see through it a little bit more than a drawing paper. And typically the difference for me is a sketch paper is for quick practicing. It's for studies. I might take it on the go. It's cheaper. That sort of thing. I could draft with it, whereas a drawing paper is going to be for maybe more polished, finished drawings. Could still be kept in a sketchbook, but maybe they're drawings I spend some more time on. They're not as quick and as loose. But that's kind of the difference there, is just knowing about the weight, and they just dub a lower weight as sketch and a higher weight as drawing. And then this is just to show you like sketch paper versus drawing paper. So sketch paper is going to have a lot less tooth, a lot less texture, but then what that means is you can't have as much range of value on a sketch paper as you can a drawing paper. Now, if you look at these two images, you might look at the drawing paper and say, oh, that looks pretty grainy. I don't want it to be so grainy. Keep in mind, you can smooth, you can blend, you can fill all those little valleys in, but because the paper is thicker and has more tooth, it can hold more value, more graphite, thus producing a drawing with a higher range of value. thus making it look more realistic. There's more depth there. So again, that's the difference between choosing a higher weight paper versus a sketch paper. So even though it looks kind of grainy, you can blend that out, make it look smooth and beautiful too. And then this is just like a little kind of sketch paper versus drawing paper. Again, a lot of this is what I just mentioned, but sketch paper, your quick practice studies, lighter weight, good, pretty much dry media only. If you put watercolor on sketch paper, it's going to do all the little folding and buckling, and it's not going to lay flat. Sketch paper is usually pretty inexpensive. Sometimes drawing paper is still pretty much a dry media only thing, but I have sometimes gotten away with like a little watercolor pencil if I'm not doing too much water with it. You could maybe get away with it. And I want to put toned paper up here too, because I think toned paper is really important. And I'm not talking just about toned paper for pastels, which I'll get to in a minute, but they make just toned drawing paper. So it's like a medium surface. It's a similar weight as drawing paper. Toned tan and toned gray are really nice. And why would you want a toned paper? It's because you're not starting on black, you're not starting on white. You're starting on a middle value, which then allows you to put more value in. The only downside is instead of using one pencil, you need two, because you need to bring white into it. You need to bring your highlights back in because you can't use the white of the paper. It's like a little white charcoal pencil, a white marker, a white gel pen, anything like that. So that's the advantage of toned paper, is you can just create more depth because you're adding in darks and lights versus working on white where you're only adding in your dark ranges. And then just to show you, here's some just examples on some toned paper, graphite with the deer, and then on the right, charcoal. So you can play with like black charcoal and white charcoal together, and then just get these really beautiful, you know, high contrast images. And you can, I highly recommend too, if you don't have them, grabbing a black charcoal pencil and a white charcoal pencil. I think it's so good to have one of each. I even use them for prepping paintings, like a still life painting. Sometimes I'll render my value in charcoal before I paint it. Newsprint paper. Newsprint paper is a great alternative to sketch paper as well, and it's super, super low weight. It's almost kind of see-through if you hold it up a little bit. It's kind of like a grayish color. Some artists like this and keep it in stock. That's usually me. I love to have it around. My colleagues like, I could do without it. But I like it. It's cheap. I usually buy it in huge, big pieces and I chop it up. But I like to do drafts on it because, or sketches for paintings on newsprint paper, because it's easy to transfer it to my canvas or my wood panel with just a little bit of transfer paper. And so that's what I like it for. It's kind of like a take it or leave it thing. I don't think you have to have it, but I like it for some things. But you can find it in a pad like this. You can find it in like a stack. Bristol paper. Bristol paper is one of my favorite, or Bristol board, you could describe it as. You can buy it in a pack, like a pad of sheets, or you can buy it individually. So Bristol is an amazing surface because it's good for dry medium and it's good for wet medium, and it comes with two surfaces usually. So you could buy just a smooth or just a vellum surface, but you can usually in your pack will have one of each. Like each piece, one side will be smooth, the other side will be vellum, and you can see on this little graphic how it's made. So Bristol is generally, it's drawing paper, but it's glued together under pressure, making it like a stiff, stronger surface. But it's not a canvas panel, and it's not a board either. It's still paper, but it's like very thick, very sturdy. A lot of illustrators use it. You can use it with gouache, you can use it with watercolor, you can use it with acrylic and all types of drawing mediums. Like smoother surface is really good for like pen and ink, markers because there's not as much tooth and you can create really fine lines. Whereas the vellum surface is really good for graphite and colored pencil, charcoal, crayon, because you have those peaks and valleys, that tooth, which again grabs that medium. It allows you to create more contrast. And the other thing I like Bristol paper for is you can put it through your printer and you can print like nice like prints on them of your artwork, or if you ever buy like digital downloads from Etsy, I've done that, but Bristol can go through a printer too. Colored pencil paper. Colored pencil paper is kind of a fake thing, I think, to be honest with you, because really it's just kind of like drawing paper, really, but just a little bit heavier. And the texture of the paper, it's a heavyweight paper, you've got a vellum surface, which, as I described in the previous slide, vellum, you still have those like little bumps and valleys, so you can build up application of layers. So colored pencil paper is not that different than like a kind of heavier drawing paper or a rougher drawing paper, but you can buy it specifically. I have tried some of the specific Strathmore colored pencil paper brand. I do like it, it's nice, but it's not like you have to get it for colored pencils, because I think colored pencils, especially if you're using high quality like a Prismacolor, work really well on like so many different kinds of papers. So this is something I think it's fun, but not necessary. Marker paper and board, however, I think marker paper is wonderful if you're getting into Copic markers and playing around with that, because of how this paper is made. It's pretty thin. It's a thinner weight, so you're not going to want to add any like water to this type of paper, but it's designed to not bleed. So it caters with the marker to not bleed, and it doesn't soak into the paper either, rather than it floats on the surface. It sits on the top, which allows you to smooth, to blend, to create transitions with markers. So this isn't like markers, like a Crayola marker on, you know, just any kind of paper where you start to see the little bleed and that goes off. This doesn't happen with this kind of paper because it's made for this. So marker paper, I have some of this exact paper. Markers are something I don't do a ton of, but when I do, I really do like this paper. I notice the difference big time. Pastel papers and boards. These to me are kind of similar to the colored pencil paper that I kind of mentioned, but I think a little bit more necessary, because pastel papers are typically coming in a whole bunch of different colors. Yes, you can get it in white, you can get them in off-whites, but typically you're working on grays or browns or tans or even bright colors. And there's a lot of texture in this type of paper to grip the pastel and for the color to stay on the paper. Pastels are a type of material that are going to work on pretty much any type of paper that you want to use it with, but this type of paper in particular is going to be perfect for holding all of that color. Printmaking papers. Now, printmaking papers I put up here for drawing as well, because they can be a great paper to draw and paint on. And the reason why is because they're so durable. They are meant to withstand being soaked, being in tubs of water for long periods of time, so that they can be printed on. So you can, in turn, use printmaking papers with a lot of water, with watercolor. You could do mixed media with them, because they're going to withhold pretty much anything you're going to throw their way. But printmaking paper is also really expensive because of how it's made and because of the fact that it can withstand so much. But if you buy it in these little pads, usually it's a lot more affordable than if you buy like the big individual sheets. But I mean, they can be fun to play around with. Even like a small little notepad can be really fun to play around with some different you know, watercolor or acrylic. You could even paint oil on printmaking paper. You could do gouache, really anything. Vellum. Vellum is a really fun paper. Some people kind of put it in the tracing paper category a little bit, although it's sort of different. Originally it was made from calf skin, although now it's typically made from like an imitation cotton product. It's really good for like technical drawing, storyboarding, but then what I like it for is more like decorative arts or layering drawings, because you can sort of see through it. It's sort of transparent, but it holds graphite. It's going to hold all your dry medium, but then you could paint on it too. So it caters really well for mixed media. Like I said, layering, you could do multiple sheets of vellum with different layers of drawings on them. I've taken vellum before and I've done a drawing on the front and then I painted on the back. So some of the paint would come through and show through the vellum. So it can be just a really fun kind of specialty paper. It's like not your everyday paper, but something to use for special things. Watercolor paper, I know I've talked a lot about watercolor paper. I honestly think watercolor paper is sort of like the jack of all trades as far as art papers, because you can pretty much use it for anything. But the most important thing to know is that watercolor paper is made 3 ways. You can get handmade watercolor paper, which is really expensive. It's usually you buy it by the sheet, you buy it really large. Traditionally, you tear it. You might have like a big, they make these big kind of straight edge metal kind of things. I don't know what you call them off the top of my head right now, but you lay that down and you pull the watercolor paper toward you and you rip it, and that's how you get those really kind of soft edges. So that handmade paper is more expensive. Mold made paper is going to be probably, that's mostly what I would use for my like nice watercolor paintings. It's typically the nicer stuff you're going to buy in like a pad at the store. And then you've got machine made, which is typically going to be like your really cheapy watercolor paper that doesn't hold your color. It kind of gets distorted. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've definitely bought a cheap pad of watercolor paper and it was not good. So usually I try to stick with something mold made, and that's mostly like what it's the Canson, the Strathmore, like most of what you're going to see at the store. I just always avoid like the cheapest brand, and you're going to be fine when it comes to watercolor paper. Mixed media papers. So mixed media papers are a paper that's typically has kind of a vellum drawing surface with a medium weight. So it's going to be lighter than a watercolor paper, but heavier than a drawing paper. So I think it's really good for like watercolor pencils, pen and ink. You could do marker on it, colored pencil, but I typically don't do like, and I've done acrylic on mixed media paper too, but I typically won't do like really heavy in-depth watercolor paintings on them because the paper just can't support all of the layers of color and water over time. So it might warp or buckle a little bit, but it's really good for a lot of different things. You can get it in a toned version too. There's like a tan there. I'm sure they make it in a gray as well, but it's really nice. A lot of my sketchbooks are mixed media because I know I can just pretty much do anything I want in them and it's going to hold. And then this is just to show you like a mixed media paper versus watercolor paper. Again, you're going to have common weight. You're going to have that it can hold wet media, but you're going to see the surface is slightly different. where you have like a slight tooth, that vellum drawing surface on a mixed media paper that the watercolor paper does not have, because it wasn't designed for really any kind of dry media at all. So that's kind of the difference there. Mixed media paper could be really good if you're doing kind of watercolor backgrounds and then wanting to do like a lot of line work or maybe pen and ink on top, because it's going to, that surface will take those types of materials better than watercolor paper will. So it's, you know, it's just, both are great, both can be good. I usually keep both on hand. It's just deciding, what is my artwork going to be? What materials am I going to use? So which paper would be best for this thing? Canvas panel and canvas paper, very similar. Canvas paper I think is wonderful because it comes in sheets. It's pre-gessoed already, which means it's got the white over top of like the tan canvas, and it, you know, you can cut it up, you can put it in different sizes, you can mount it later, you could frame it, and it's cheaper than canvas, and you could still tape it down to a drawing board or a surface if you don't like it to slide around on you. But canvas paper is pretty much going to take, it's going to take wash, it's going to take oil, it's going to take acrylic. It will not take watercolor super well. Not that I have put watercolor on canvas. I mean, I've told you in the past that I just like to try things. So I've tried it and it'll create like a stain, but just keep in mind, it's not going to hold it and be really saturated. It's going to be very light and kind of washy, transparent, like a stain. But canvas paper is very similar to like a stretched canvas. It's the same idea. It's the canvas itself though might not be as thick, because a stretched canvas, usually the canvas itself is it's a thicker weight. Now acrylic paper, so what's this all about? Because we see this in the stores. The biggest thing about acrylic paper, well, there's two things about it. One, it has a linen finish. Okay, so it's really nice for acrylic paint. That particular finish, they just mesh well together. So it's just a finish. But then the other component is that acrylic paper is really, really heavy, like 246 pound heavy. So when you're looking at a watercolor paper that's 160 pound versus an acrylic paper that's 246 pounds, you can just, you know, you decide, do you want that thicker, heavier weight paper? Because it's still paper, it's not canvas. So you're still getting the quality of painting on a paper, but you're getting that heaviness, that support, especially with acrylic paint, because you build it up so much. Like I'll have students do acrylic paintings on like, you know, like 100-pound watercolor paper sometimes, and how heavy that painting is when we're done, how much weight that adds to the paper. Whereas when you have an acrylic paper like this, it can hold that, it can withstand that. It was made for all those layers and that building up. Wood panels, I did decide to throw this in. I've talked about them before. And these could even be like the, like down at the bottom, like the different like discs cut from like trees and coasters and all those sorts of things. But any type of wood is going to take oil, acrylic, and gouache. Sometimes you can even get away with dry mediums on there. I've done charcoal. You can do marker on them if you seal them. So if you get like a fixative spray, it'll seal your charcoal so it won't make it smudgy anymore. So you can buy fixative spray, or you could even buy an aerosol can of hairspray, like an Aqua Net or something like that, and spray that on, and that helps seal it in too. And then as far as like prep for wood panels, because I get asked that a lot, you can use them as is. So I could take a wood panel and paint like, I don't know, like a little strawberry in the middle and leave all the wood around it. and it could be as is. You could gesso it, meaning gesso is an acrylic medium. It's typically white, but you can tint it or you can buy black. And it's like a primer, it's a surface. So like when you buy a canvas from Michaels and it's wrapped up and everything, it's white, it's already covered with gesso, because typically canvas as a material doesn't have gesso on it. Or you can cover with a wash. So you could take like an acrylic wash or, and then layer that over top of the wood panel if you want to. Those are just kind of options for ways you could prep it, not necessary though. Palette paper, I decided to throw this in here too, because typically, I mean, palette paper is, in a sense, for mixing your paint. And I do typically use my actual palette more than anything, but palette paper is really, really nice for kind of quick projects on the go. It reminds me of wax paper in a sense. But the acrylic paint, like you can still peel it off the palette paper, and you can actually, or you can leave it on the palette paper. And I've actually cut up palette paper before and I've made like collages with it, or like put it into my paintings before. So I just think palette paper, it's not, you don't have to have it, but it's kind of like a nice thing to have. And like one pad will last you a long time. You can even cut it up into little pieces to make little mini palettes. Just kind of a nice thing to have. And then another thing I like to throw in here too is tracing paper, just because I think tracing paper is a really, has so many purposes. Obviously you can trace with it, but sometimes what I'll do is I'll do a drawing on one side and I'll paint back. You can paint gouache on it. With acrylic, it'll curl until it dries. And then when it dries, it'll dry flat. And it's a really kind of fun thing. And you can sew into tracing paper. So I've like sewn tracing paper on top of like watercolor paper before to create layers and paintings or art. So it can become a mixed media piece. But the learning tool, what I like to use it for as a learning tool is if you do a drawing, let's say you do a drawing of a still life with a basket of apples, and you have an empty space and you can't decide if you want to put one more thing there. Well, you can lay the piece of tracing paper down, draw one more thing, and get a visual to see if you like it or not, because you can see you're drawing through it. So, or it's nice for placement. You could draw something on it and place it over on your paper and decide, do I like it here or do I like it here? Do I like it here or here? And so it's just like a way to sort of see and visualize without having to commit to something and putting it on your paper and having regrets later. So my students have found that very helpful. It's kind of like a little way to hold their hands and make them feel more confident when we're doing things. So it's another nice thing I like to have in kind of my toolkit.